Paulann Church, great to see you today, and I welcome those of you in our live stream that are watching on live stream. Man, I'm pretty fired up to be here. It's a good day to be here, man. Next week's Refuge Weekend. It's a big weekend for us, man. So, in fact, all of our students, we have 300 plus students that spend the weekend kind of meeting in small groups. They'll be in church next Sunday, and a big portion of them come to this service. So if you're a normal 10 o'clocker, you might want to consider rolling our 10:10 service that meets right now over in Impact Auditorium, or coming to our 8:30. That helped create a little space in here. Hopefully, Lord willing, we'll be packed next Sunday, but it's going to be a good Sunday. I encourage you to come and be a part of that. MLK weekend, this weekend, man, we want to remember the legacy of Martin Luther King, what he stood for, and the fight that he had for civil rights. We want to be a part of that. So take the time to celebrate and remember this weekend. And then after Refuge is Super Bowl Sunday, man. I come to the realization that I don't think the Cowboys are going to make it this year. Man, so isn't it, there's always next year if you're a Cowboy fan, right? Always next year. We're always the most optimistic people in the world, man. 'Cause we're gonna turn it around next year. Anyway, it's good to be here today, man. We're in a series called Epic Fail. I like that opening video. That one guy's actually, if you notice, the guy in the video is playing guitar this morning, and so I think our graphics artist called him out, set him up falling into that water. That took place last weekend. I know that water was cold, but we're in a series called Epic Fail, and we're not talking about failing, because I know that failing is kind of a part of life. Sometimes we don't want to do it, but it's not really, when we're going to, but it's just a matter of when. We all do something we wish we hadn't done, sometimes small, sometimes big. And so what we're looking at is how to get over that, right? How do you overcome a fail in your life so you can get back up and go on with your life? I was raised in Oklahoma, and my dad was a rancher, and a lot of times in the spring we'd work cattle, and we had a cow-calf operation. We'd get all these cows together, and we'd sort them out, we'd work them. And even as a kid, man, when I was a kid, my mom and my sisters, we were all in there helping. And when you're little, man, you get in a pen with a bunch of cattle, it's pretty easy to get knocked down. I mean, they turn around and hit you with a hip or a horn or something like that and knock you down. So my dad always said, hey, if you get knocked down, get back up as fast as you can, all right? And the reason is because if you get knocked down in a pen of cattle, if you don't get back up, you're going to get stomped on. That's kind of the way life is, man. Life knocks us down sometimes. You got to get back up or you'll get stomped on even more, right? I can remember this kind of etched in my brain a few years ago. I was riding my bike. I was riding my road bike. I'd actually ridden it up here to church from my house. I was riding it home. And I was looking over my left shoulder because I was going to cross the highway. And when I went to turn, my front tire caught this lip in the pavement. I was probably doing about 15. So 1 minute, everything in my life was great. And the next minute, I smacked down right on the asphalt. And what was funny about it, as soon as I hit, I just jumped right back up. I'm like, dude, I'm all right. I'm okay. Well, I really wasn't okay. I was about to die on the inside. But I wasn't going to lay there, right? Because somebody might drive by and see me, take a picture of it like that, and have me putting it on a big screen. Epic fail right there, right? There's just something about it, man. It's in your, sometimes we can get back up. Well, here's the question about an epic fail. What happens when it's something big, and it's not your fault? Like you're a part of it, but there are circumstances outside of your control that causes you to be involved in something that's a major life changer for you. How do you get back up from that type of an incident, all right? And so to take a look at this, I want to look at Scripture. I want to look at Old Testament passage, Genesis 37. So if you got your Bible, open it up to Genesis chapter 37. I like looking at the Old Testament. I'm kind of an Old Testament geek sometime because Old Testament history is given to us to point us towards Jesus, all right? And this is where we ultimately always need to get back, is to Jesus. And even, you see, Jesus on the day he was, crucified, that very day, the day he resurrected from the dead on that first Easter, he takes a walk, it tells us in the last book of Luke, to a little town called Emmaus, and he's walking along with two disciples, and then the disciples are like all, depressed. How come you're depressed? Well, we were followers of Jesus, and he was a great prophet. He was doing all this great stuff. We thought he was going to restore Israel and be the Messiah, but today he was crucified. And 3 days ago, he was crucified, and man, our dreams were crushed on that day. And then this morning, these women claimed to have seen him alive. And the disciples said that he was alive, but nobody's seen him, and we don't know what to do with that. And so, we're just kind of depressed about it. And Jesus, who's the resurrected king, right there beside him, but they don't recognize him. Why? Because he'd been crucified, you see, in their mind. And And he says, oh man, you're slow to learn. You're so foolish. Did you not read the prophets that said he must suffer before he comes into his glory? And then he makes this statement for us. It's recorded in Matthew, or in Luke chapter 24, 27. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, all the scriptures they were talking about was the Old Testament. He said, let me just show you in the Old Testament how it all really points towards Jesus. And so this is what we want to see today as we look at this Old Testament passage, how it points us towards Jesus, all right? So this is Genesis chapter 37. I'll start in verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. Verse 2, this is the account or the history of the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, Zilpah. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that. I'm sure that's not correct. But his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, this is the history of Jacob, all right? Now, Jacob's name was also known as Israel. This is the story of Israel, all right? And sometimes when we read Old Testament history, you know, we start talking about Israel, and we know that somehow they were in bondage in Egypt, and God heard their cry, and he sent them a deliverer named Moses, and Moses came down and brought them out of Egypt. They crossed through the Red Sea, right, and went on into the Promised Land, which really is just a picture of what Jesus wants to do in our lives. We are all in bondage to sin. God sends us a deliverer named Jesus to bring us out. We go through the waters of baptism, just like we saw this morning. Right? And we begin to live for Jesus Christ. He takes us into a better life, a promised life of blessing for us. But the question becomes, when you read that, you're like, well, the nation of Israel was in Egypt. How'd they get to Egypt to start with? Why were they all down there in Egypt to start with? And the answer to that question is found in Genesis chapter 37. It's by Jacob through his son Joseph. So just a brief history of Jacob and the nation of Israel. You know, it starts off with Abraham. Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation, and Abraham had two prominent sons, right? Ishmael and Isaac. The promise went through Isaac, and so Isaac marries someone named Rebekah, and they have a set of twins, all right? Esau, the firstborn, comes out, and he's all covered with hair, so they gave him the name Esau, which means hairy. They were too creative in their names back there. This one's hairy. Oh, Esau, there it is right there. And then when he was born, a twin, the other son came out, Jacob, but he had a hold of Esau's heel. He had a hold of his heel when he came out, so they called him Jacob, which literally means he who grasped the heel. I guess they were just had a real shortage of names back then, and they just whatever it was. And literally it also means like deceiver. Like someone would to run by you, reach out and trip them by the heel, trick them, deceiver. Jacob means deceiver, and he lived up to his name. He deceived Esau out of the birthright, and he deceived him out of the blessing when Isaac died. And Isaac and Esau was so mad about that, he's like, dude, I'm going to kill you, literally. And so Jacob had to flee for his life. He left the promised land, went to Edom to his uncle Laban. And there when he gets to Laban, he finds somebody that was his match that was more deceiving than he was. And he falls in love with Laban's daughter Rachel and says, hey, I want to marry your daughter Rachel. And Laban says, work for me 7 years and you can. He's like, all right. He works 7 years. Comes to his marriage day. Apparently, the bride had quite the veil on, and Jacob must have drank too much wine because he thought he was marrying Rachel. He went to bed with Rachel, but he woke up with her older sister, Leah. Oh. I'm not sure what happened the next morning when that realization came about. He went to bed with Rachel and woke up with Leah. That's just the way marriage is sometimes. I'm just saying, you know. And Jacob goes back to Laban, what have you done? And Laban's like, oh, you know, man, it wouldn't have been right for you to marry the younger before the older. Work for me another 7 years and I'll give you Rachel too. So he does it. He works another 7 years, and then he marries Rachel, and then they start having kids, and Leah could have kids and Rachel couldn't have any. Leah has 4 kids in a row. Reuben, the firstborn, Simeon, Levi. Gets down to Judah. You guys know Judah, the line of the tribe of Judah, right? Number 4 out of Leah. That point, Rachel, she's upset about all this. She can't have any kids. She's got a slave girl that works for her, servant girl. She says to Jacob, sleep with my servant girl so I can have some kids. So Jacob does that. They have 2 more kids through the slave girl. Her name was Bilhah, and the name I can't pronounce. And after 2 kids are born to her, Leah's mad about it now. So she says, well, why don't you sleep with my servant girl so I can have some more kids? Jacob apparently was happy to oblige that, and now he had 2 more boys through her, the servant girl. And then Rachel kind of, Leah kicks back in, has a couple more, gets them up to 10, has Diana, has a girl, and then in his old age, Rachel, who's been barren her whole life, gives a son to Jacob, and his name is Joseph. It literally means, Rachel says, the Lord has given me a son. May he add me another. That's what Joseph means. May he add me another. And she had one last son. When she moved into the promised land, Jacob and Rachel had one last son, but she died giving childbirth, and so they named him Ben-Anoi, which means son of my trouble, because she knew she was dying. But after she died, Jacob changed his name to Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. Okay? The 12 sons of Israel. When Jacob was in Edom, when he moved back into the promised land, he was getting ready to face Esau's brother and his 400 troops. He was so scared about that. God showed up with him one night, and this angel showed up and began to wrestle with him all night long. And finally, about daybreak, the angel said, let me go. It's about daybreak. And Jacob said, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And this angel reached out and touched his hip with his finger. When he did, it dislocated Jacob's hip. And he learned in that moment that you can't fight with God because God's going to overcome. He'd spent his whole life fighting with God. And the angel asked him, what is your name, to Jacob? And he replied, the man said, Jacob. And the angel replied, this is in Genesis 32:28, your name will no longer be Jacob the deceiver, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. Israel means he who strives with God. This is Jacob's whole life. He spent his whole life, like some of you, fighting against what God has for you, till he finally came to the realization he'd be better off surrendering his life. And he became Israel. Sometimes God refers to him as Jacob when he's acting like Jacob, and sometimes he refers to him as Israel when he's acting like Israel. Genesis 37, this is the account of Jacob, primarily of his son Joseph, the son that he loved, just like God loved his son as well. When he was a young man, verse 2 of 17 years old, he's tending his flocks with his brothers. What 2 brothers are he tending flocks with? The 2 brothers that were born, the 4 brothers that were born by the slave girls. That all their life they had probably been treated a little bit, mistreated because they weren't, of Rachel, they weren't of Leah. And here's Joseph, the younger brother. He brings back a bad report. Those guys went out to the deer lease and doing things they shouldn't be doing, Dad. You should put the bust on them. And so they didn't really like Joseph because of that. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his brothers because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him a richly ornamented robe for him, a coat of many colors, to set him apart. Favoritism towards this son Joseph. And when his other brothers, verse 4, saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. For he said to them, listen to the dream I had. We were building sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Probably not the best thing to tell your brothers. And his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream that he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers, listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Not only you 11 brothers, but mom and dad as well. And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, bro, you're going to get killed. What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send them to you. Very well, he replied. He's 17 years old. He's got this coat of many colors, which is probably like something that set him apart. And obviously he's at the house not working when all 10 of his brothers, Benjamin was still too young at this point, were out tending the sheep near Shechem. Now, Shechem's about 50 miles away. A lot of bad blood in Shechem for the boys of Israel, but he set off to take them some food. And he gets there, he can't find them. Somebody says, oh, they're in Dothan, about another 15 miles away. So he's now 65 miles away from home, and he comes upon his brothers. This is in verse 18. He went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Verse 18, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Not like, you make me so mad I'm going to kill you, but like, you make me so mad I'm literally going to kill you, Cain and Abel style. Here comes that dreamer, verse 19. They said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Reuben, firstborn, heard this. He tried to rescue them from their hands. Let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said that because his plan was to come back later and rescue him and take him back to his father. But they did take his advice. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the coat of many colors he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. I assume they were going to leave him there until he died. Verse 25, and then they sat down to eat their meal. Probably the very meal that Joseph had brought them. And then they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spice, balm, and myrrh. And Judah, brother number 4, said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, hey, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And the brothers agreed. And so they take him and sell him as a slave to this passing caravan. Now, I don't care how you spin that out there or what part Joseph played, but that's an epic fail. You jump upon your brother, beat him up, strip him naked, throw him in a cistern, then sell him as a slave to who knows what's going to happen to him at that point. They sell him as a slave. Reuben comes back. He intends to rescue him. He's gone. What have you done? How are we going to cover this up? They take that cloak. They put some goat blood on it. They go back and tell Jacob, your son was devoured by a wild animal. See, this is his cloak as proof. He goes, I'll go into my grave mourning my much-loved son. I don't know what that does to your conscience if you're one of the 10 brothers. And then the story ends. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Potiphar's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, there's a lot of things about that story that just kind of zip right by. You kind of wonder what the details were really like, you know, what it was like to take that 400-mile journey from the promised land to Egypt when you've been sold into slavery. What's going through your mind or how you're treated or what's done unto you. And I think Joseph had every right to be a little bit upset about that, maybe even mad at God. I can't believe this happened to me. You know, God must have abandoned me. Does God not care about me? I've been sold into slavery. My brothers beat me and humiliated me, threw me in a cistern, left me to dead. When I begged them not to sell me, they sold me anyway. He has every right to take the victim. Okay? But the thing about the story of Joseph, and I think one of the things we need to learn with it is you never see Joseph take the position of the victim. You never see him blame everything that's going on in his life on what happened to him. And this is pretty common in our society today, is to say, man, my life would be so much better if this hadn't happened. And my life would be so much better if this hadn't happened to me, or if that person hadn't done that to me. And we go for years living that way. But this is not a biblical concept. The biblical concept is we are to go forward in faith. Now, we might need to go back and look at our past and the things that have happened to us in the past so that we can get some healing. But God doesn't want us to stay there. And the problem is when we have this victim mentality that it's always somebody else's fault that our life's not right, it keeps us from living the life God has for us now, right? And we're like, well, I'm mad at that person over there, and if I was to forgive them, that'd let them off the hook. I'm going to show them. I'm going to stay mad at them. It'd be Joseph's mentality. I'm going to show them. I'm going to stay mad at them. They were 400 miles away. Did it hurt them at all if Joseph was mad at him or not? They wouldn't even know, right? But as long as you're a victim, see, it keeps you stuck in the past, whereas Jesus Christ comes to set you free from your past. You know, it's Galatians 2:20, my favorite verse. So I've been crucified with Christ, Paul says, and it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ that liveth in me. And the life that I live in the flesh, I now live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself up for me. I used to always view that in reference to sin, because this is what my life consisted of, a lot of sin. When I gave my life to Jesus, though, I was crucified with Christ, and it's no longer that person who's alive. God made me a brand new person that day I got saved. And I'm living a different life than I lived before, because Jesus Christ empowers me to live a different life. But I realize it doesn't just deal with your past sin. It also deals with your past. Jesus Christ wants to set you free from your past, that you can live a different life going forward. And that's exactly what you see in Joseph's life. He never takes the position of the victim. He's sold into slavery, had every right to be for. He get taken down to Egypt. He's sold on the auction block. He gets bought by this guy named Potiphar, who happens to be a royal official. It says in 39 verse 1, he was taken down to Egypt. Anytime you see the word Egypt, it's always down, because it's a picture of the world. He's taken down into Egypt, and Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites. Verse 2, how is it possible that Joseph did not take the position of the victim? Because he knew that God was with him. And this is the key repeated phrase in this entire story. You see it right here in 39:2. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him, even though he's sold into slavery. You would think God had abandoned him. Hey, you ever get in a position where you think God's abandoned you? Well, how could this happen, that God could abandon me? I was a godly man. I was a father's favorite, son of Israel. I get sold into slavery. You would think God had abandoned him, but in reality, Scripture is quite clear that God is with him. In fact, it says it over and over and over again. And God was with him when he was sold into slavery. And because of that, he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord was giving him success in everything he did, he found favor in his eyes, and he became the attendant who put him in charge of his entire household. He's like, okay, I'm a slave. I'm going to make the best of being a slave. I'm going to work as hard as I can and be the best I can. And God blessed him because God was with him, right? This is us. If you're a believer in Jesus, God is with you in the same exact manner that he's with Joseph, okay? You cannot play the victim. We cannot take the position of a victim, because God is with us, okay? God is with us, so we can trust him even in the midst of a difficult situation and do the best that we can. And Joseph raises up to number 2. Now, in the Egyptian culture of that day, this is a household that had slaves. It would be like going from the promised land into the pit, into Potiphar's house, up to the penthouse. Right? That's where he was. He was slave number 2. Man, everything hinged around him. The only problem Joseph had to do was really good looking. It says in verse 6, he was well built and handsome. But it must have been in his genes, because the exact same phrase is used of his mother Rachel in 27:19. She was lovely of form and beautiful. And now Joseph is well built and handsome, so much so that Potiphar's wife took notice after a while. Chapter 39, verse 7, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Come to bed with me. Now, everything about that culture that he was in said that would be perfectly normal to do. You're a slave. You don't really have a choice. You got to do what they say. Nobody's going to hold that against you. Perhaps even it might enhance your career if you were to sleep with the boss's wife. This is a golden opportunity. No reason in that culture for Joseph not to do that. But it says in verse 8, but he refused. With me in charge, he told her, the master does not concern himself with anything in his house, because everything he owns he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now, it would have been perfectly acceptable in this, give into this temptation in the culture in which we live. And culture has a way of causing us to act like it. But he didn't do it because he's a believer in God. God would not have me to do this, he says. Now, as a believer in this room today, okay, I know every person in here lives in a culture that says it's okay to do that sort of thing. Hey, nobody's going to think that's bad if you sleep around, or if you cheat on your boss, or if you cheat on your income taxes, or if you cheat on your test. If everybody at work cusses, what's the big deal if you cuss? Just, if everybody else is doing it, what's the big deal if you do it? And the answer is, if you're a believer in Jesus, you're called to live differently. You got to think about Joseph. He might have been the only believer in all of Egypt. He got nobody to come around, nobody to hold him accountable, nobody to help him. And yet when he's faced with this particular temptation, he says, man, I'm not going to do it because that would be a sin against God. And sometimes when we get in difficult situations, okay, when our world collapses in on us and we think God's abandoned us, we kind of have a tendency to think, dude, I'm going to do whatever I want. Because it ain't been helping me living for God, right? And in that moment, here's Joseph, man. He's a man of character in spite of his culture. So he doesn't play the position of the victim. He trusts God because he knows God's with him. And he's a man of character in the midst of his trial. And in this particular case, it cost him, because she keeps asking him, and finally he comes in one day and she grabs him by the cloak. Lots of cloaks in Joseph's stories. He flees, leaving the cloak in her hand. And by this point, she's so mad that he won't sleep with her. She dials up her husband and says, hey, man, that Hebrew slave, he tried to come in and make sport of me today. And the husband is so mad that he has Joseph thrown into prison. And most people believe the husband was probably onto her. Otherwise, he would have killed him on the spot. But he had him thrown into prison because he had to do something, right? So here's Joseph. Now he goes from the penthouse into the prison. Chapter 40, verse 1, sometime later. You ever wonder how long that really was? I'll tell you, 11 years. 11 years in an Egyptian prison. I don't know what that would be like. I'm just going to guess it wasn't that good, right? Now, it'd be a good time at this point to think about those dreams. Remember that dream? Everybody bowing down to him? I wonder if Joseph ever thought about that dream. A lot of dreaming in this story. The cupbearer and the chief baker, they get thrown into prison with Joseph, and one night, they both have they have a dream. They both have a dream on the same night. And the next morning, Joseph sees them. What are you guys all depressed about? We both had dreams. We can't interpret them. Joseph says, man, God can interpret dreams, and guess what? I'm a God follower. Why don't you try it out on me? So the cupbearer, who's the one that gave the Pharaoh the wine, said, well, I had this dream. There was 3 branches, and while I was watching it, leafed out, budded out, put forth grapes, and I stuck the cup up there and got the juice, and I handed it to Pharaoh, and he drank it. Joseph's like, dude, that's good news, man. You know what that means? That's an easy one right there. I had 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to lift up your head. He's going to restore you to your position. You're going to be giving him his cup of wine in 3 days, and you're going to be back in your position. That's great news. I just got one favor. When it happens, would you remember me? Would you tell him I'm stuck in this prison? I didn't have anything to do. I didn't deserve to be here, and I'm stuck here because I'd like to get out, because I've got a dream I'd like to fulfill. I'd like to go back to Canaan and see this dream fulfilled in my life. And then the baker saw that he got a favorable interpretation. He said, what do you think about my dream? I had a dream where I had 3 baskets of bread and pastries up on my head, but I was going to deliver it to Pharaoh. But before I did, the birds came along and began to eat the bread out of the top basket. What do you think that means? He said, well, bro, I got bad news for you. Pharaoh's going to lift up your head too, but he's not going to lift it up in a positive way. He's going to lift it off your shoulder. 3 days from now, Pharaoh's going to kill you, and birds are going to eat your body. Like, oh, man, I wish I hadn't heard that. 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday. He lifts up the one cupbearer to his former position, and he's serving wine that evening back in the top spot. But he hangs the chief baker exactly like Joseph said it was going to happen. Last verse of 40:23. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. What do you do when your dreams don't come true? What do you do when life doesn't turn out like you think life should turn out? When you're Joseph, man, there comes a point where you just got to, by faith, hang on to Jesus. And this is what Joseph does for 2 more years. The very next verse says he's in that same prison for 2 more years. And then, unexpectedly, Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has these 2 dreams on the same night, and the dream is this: 7 fat cows came out of the Nile. He said, I saw these 7 fat cows. They came up out of the Nile. They looked so great and healthy, and they were eating grass alongside the Nile. And while I was watching these 7 skinny cows, these ugly cows, I think the first one were Angus, second one were Longhorns. They come up out of the Nile, and they ate the first 7 cows. But when they got done eating those 7 cows, they weren't any fatter than they were before. They were still as skinny as could be. Unbelievable. And he says, man, I got to. And then he had another. He went back to sleep. He had another dream. 1 stalk of corn came up. 7 stalks, 7 ears of corn, fat and healthy, were on that stalk. And then right beside it came up another stalk. And they were skinny. And the east wind blew it up. And they ate the 7 stalks. And there was nothing left. And so he says, man, this dream means something. He got all his astronomers, all his wise men. He goes, what do these dreams mean? And none of them knew what he meant. And then his cupbearer happened to be there that day. I'm not sure what the odds of this are. You know, I was in prison one time. And there was a guy in prison, this Hebrew guy, that he interpreted my dream. And it came true exactly like he said it was going to come true. Maybe he can interpret your dream. And Pharaoh says, let's go get that guy. And on that very day, it says they went to the dungeon, the pit, and they brought him out, and they shaved him, and they gave him a bath. I'm sure he needed one. And he goes from the pit to the palace. How long did it take? 1 day, because God has the ability to change your life in an instant when you hang on to him. And he brought him from the pit to the palace, and he stands before Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, hey, can you interpret my dreams? He says, I cannot interpret your dream, but God can. Elohim. And you're in luck because I happen to be a God follower. He says, tell me your dream. He told him the dream about the 7 cows. And he says, here's the interpretation of your dream. God gave it to you twice, because when God gives it to you twice, that means he's going to do it, and he's going to do it in a hurry. You're going to have 7 years of plenty. For the whole nation, we're going to have 7 years of plenty. You're going to have all that you can eat and more, but it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And those 7 years of famine are going to be so bad, okay, that we're going to eat up everything that happened in the first 7 years, and there's going to be nothing left during those 7 years. And Pharaoh's like, that's going to be harsh. What should I do? And Joseph says, well, dude, that's easy. You just need to appoint someone that during the 7 years of plenty, they would store up all the grain so that when the 7 years of famine come along, you'd have enough food to live for those 7 years. God's told you what he's going to do. Why don't you adjust your life according to what God's told you he's going to do? Right? And so the Pharaoh goes, dude, that's a good idea. Who should I appoint? I think I'm going to appoint you, because God's obviously with you. I hereby decree that you, Joseph, are the second man in the entire nation of Egypt. He goes from the pit to the palace to being second man in charge of the entire. They put him in a chariot like a limousine, run him around town, give him a wife. Everything in his life changes in 1 day. He goes on during that 7 years of plenty. He's storing up all these food. He's the top dog. Number 2 man in Egypt, and his wife has 2 kids. This is, I think, the cool part. His wife has 2 kids. You know what he gives them? Jewish names. Why? Because he wanted all the glory to go to God, right? Why is that? Because God always keeps his promises. Every dream in this came exactly true, exactly like it said. Well, you might say, well, what about Joseph? Well, this famine, you see, was a worldwide famine. It didn't just affect Egypt. It affected the known world at that time, which meant it affected Canaan. Guess who lived in Canaan at the time? Jacob and his 10 brothers, 11 sons. Guess what? They didn't have anything to eat. Only place in the whole world that had any food? Egypt. Guess who came to dinner? 10 brothers rolled down there to buy some food from Egypt to keep from starving. Guess who's down there to greet them? Joseph, their brother. If they don't recognize him, takes them through a series of events. And finally, by about the time we get to chapter 45, he reveals to them who he is. It says in 45, verse 4, Joseph said to the brother, come close to me. And when they had done so, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Dude, 17 years later, think that wasn't a shock? Think they didn't have a number 2 guy in Egypt? Says, guess who I am, bro? Forget what I look like? I'm your brother Joseph, who you sold into Egypt. Now, if there was ever a man that wanted to seek revenge, it was all in his hands right here But he says to him, 45:5, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and it's just getting started because it's going to go on for 5 more years. There will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. That somehow in the midst of all this, Joseph recognized the sovereignty of God, that God is actually in control, that our lives are not dictated by fate, but by God himself. He said, I know you meant it for evil, but God used it for good, because through me, I'm going to save your lives, and the promise is going to continue. And this is what happened. The nation of Israel, the family of Israel, moved down to Egypt and preserved their line, and they stayed in Egypt until they went from a family to a nation. And what you have in this particular passage is this picture of what Jesus Christ has done for us, that men meant it for evil, but God used it for good. That when he was crucified on the cross, all the dreams of the apostles were crushed, but because God had something better for them. In chapter 50, all the brothers come around Jesus and bow down before him, saying, we are your slaves. Why is it? It was the fulfillment of the dream. So when you look at Joseph, Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Jesus was rejected by his brothers. Joseph was sold into slavery. Jesus took the form of a servant, even until the point of death. Jesus suffered evil, and God used it for good, that people might be saved. Jesus took all the evil of the world upon himself on the cross. But God meant it for good, so that you might be saved. And when you put your faith and trust in Jesus, therefore, we are not a victim. We trust God, for he is with us. We live lives of character in spite of our culture, and we remember, in spite of whatever's going on in your life, that God's promises always come true. And we can stand our lives on the promises of God. Amen. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Jesus, I know in this service, man, there are some people that are going through difficult times that is outside of their control. That's not their fault, that we cannot understand it. But in the midst of that, we know that we have a God who is able to bring good out of bad, to produce good out of evil. He has a plan that's bigger than what we can see, to do more than we can imagine. And so I pray today we could get a hold of that by faith. By faith, Father. And I pray for those in this room that have never yet stepped over and trusted their lives to Jesus. Today might be their day, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to ask if you would stand up with me as we close out with this last song, and then we'll be dismissed after that.